Okay, happy April Fool's Day, world history. It is good to be broadcasting to you from my home. Um, when I started teaching many moons ago, I did not see this happening. But here we are, and I'm happy to be talking with you, or at least talking at you, I suppose. You're going to be probably hear a lot of messages about how you are missed and how the teachers wish that they could see you. And that's true. I do miss you all. And uh, if I had to teach you, which I do, I would much rather be doing this face to face and interacting with all of you and taking questions. Now, as we try to launch into some sort of normalcy and teaching and learning and being Stargate Eagles, um, that is a quick thing that I need to start working out of my repertoire is that lip smack. I did sociology before this, and I'm sure it annoys you, and please take comfort knowing that that annoys me. So, what we've been asked to kind of do is to review material and to kind of review what we were doing before the start of our surprise spring break. And so that is my goal and my focus for our first 2 days as we try to go into the unknown. We are, of course, like Elsa, princess. Is she a princess? Elsa going into the unknown with this digital learning experience. So today we're going to go again over the events leading up to World War I and trying to set that global stage at the end of the 1800s, going into 1900. And then tomorrow we will go again over those causes of World War I, which then sets us up to hopefully go in again and then go into those go into World War I itself starting next week. So that is our hope, and that is kind of what we are looking at going into this week and trying to restart our school year. There will be a quick assignment, some sort of assignment. I have an idea about what that will look like, and I will put the instructions for that in Google Classroom. So here we go. Hopefully some of this looks familiar to you. And we briefly talked about Japan and China at the end of the 1800s. And the reason for doing that is that you have their entrance into the global stage. And because we are about to enter a global conflict, it should be important to know kind of how these places became integrated into the expanding global system before the first global war. So our first focus is Japan. And remember that Japan, for most of its history, had tried to stay relatively isolated from the rest of what was going on around the world, right? The problem being that by 1853, the Europeans, and in starting to include America, have been imperializing the vast majority of the planet and the human populations on the planet. And so in 1853, as that process is going on, Japan wakes up one day and is being confronted by Matthew Perry, who is an admiral in the United States Navy. And essentially, he demands that Japan open itself up to the rest of the world. And this process is taken by the United States. The ships are unannounced, and Japan quickly realizes that it has no way to resist this Western power, the United States of America. And so, because it has no sort of authority or power to resist this incursion of the West, Japan is forced to open itself up to the United States and allows the United States to send an ambassador to reside in Japan. And Japan's long isolation ends. The major European powers, who had done most of the imperializing of the world, see what the Americans have accomplished and also demand from Japan that they allow European ambassadors into Japan. Again, Japan having no power to resist these militaristic and industrialized nations, are essentially forced to open themselves up to the West. This process showed the Japanese that they had fallen far behind. As far as like the global arms race, right? That industrialization that we've been covering earlier this semester, Japan was very far behind, and rightfully so. The Japanese blamed its leaders, and its leader at the time is, of course, the shogun, whose power is justified by the power of the military itself. Well, if your authority is justified by military power, and you have no military power with which to resist others, well, then why do you have power at all? And so the Japanese start to turn against the shogun, who had been in power for centuries. Okay, this isolation, and then suddenly being confronted with how far behind it was, this being Japan, realized that it also needed to modernize if it wanted to keep up with the West. And of course, modernization in this time period looks like industrialization. So, because the Japanese, again, rightfully so, saw that the shogun had allowed Japan to fall so far behind, local Japanese turn against the shogun, both for kind of the woeful state of how prepared Japan was, especially a militaristic Japan, which had no military power to resist the West. And then also the idea that, like, with isolation comes a certain value in your own culture, right? One of the reasons that the Japanese want to resist the West is to not only resist the power of the West, but to also resist the religion and the culture of Europeans and the Americans. But they're being forced out of their isolation, and you see more and more westernization and Western presence in Japan. And a lot of Japanese are not happy about this and rightfully blame the shogun. So now the shogun, centuries before, had kicked out the Japanese emperor. But with the failure of the shogun, calls for the emperor to be restored became louder and louder. And so in 1867, about 14 years after the first kind of American showing up in the West, the people turn against the shogun. And you get an event called the Meiji Restoration, where the shogunate in Japan is ended, and the traditional emperor is returned to power in Japan. And the thing about this particular imperial family is that they're going to be in power in Japan, both during World War I and then famously in World War II. I'm a little staccato there because I'm Hirohito. I have a book about the leader of the Japanese Empire leading up to World War II, and he is famous for being in charge during World War II, Japan's role in World War II, and then, of course, looking at where Japan belongs today in the world. A lot of that doesn't happen without the Meiji being restored to power in Japan in 1867. So, part of that modernization that Japan was behind on is, again, like ending the feudal system, right? The shogun is essentially like the king, and he has local lords under them, and they control land, which is the Japanese feudal system, which is an old way of thinking. So the feudal system in Japan is ended. Japan gets a constitution with a representative type of government with the emperor at the head of it. Okay, again, constitutional monarchies are another sign of modernization. A lot of ideas caused by the Enlightenment, parts of the social contract showing up in Japan with the emergence of the West and the restoration of the Meiji. And then, of course, Japan's rapid participation in industrialization. And so for about 50 years or so after the Meiji are restored to the imperial crown, Japan has to modernize, and that includes industrialization, which again sets the stage for Japan to participate in the upcoming world wars and the empire building of these powers. Okay, China. So, since 1644, China had been ruled by the Manchus, which were a foreign ethnic population to most of the Chinese. But they were in power, and that was the mandate of heaven, as the Chinese would call it, for this particular group to rule over China. There had been peace and stability for nearly 2 centuries, but again, slow but sure European presence in China. Okay. The Chinese don't need a lot from the Europeans, but the Europeans, again, with the gigantic population of China and all the goods and luxury resources that come out of China, it's just too much temptation for European powers to make their presence felt in China and the Chinese economy and the global economy. So what the Europeans, and specifically what the British East India Company does, is that even though China doesn't need much from the Europeans, one thing that the Europeans can supply into China to make a tremendous amount of money on is opium. And so since the 1700s, the British East India Company, which ruled in this part of the world with the authority of the British government, smuggles in opium into China. Now, we had kind of tried to make this parallel with what it looks like in China versus what it looks like today, is that, the United States has its own kind of opium epidemic in which kind of erodes away at the core of a society. And you could see this happening in China, in which more and more common people become addicted to opioids, which were supplied by Westerners. So you have Chinese, peasants and people consuming European opium because Europeans are bringing opium into China. And finally, in 1840, China cracks down on that opium trade. The problem with that is that it is very profitable for the British. And so in response, the government of Britain sends warships to demand that China reopens itself up to Britain with the idea that Britain wants to continue to smuggle opium into China because of the immense profits. And so I have as a note down here, this is again another example of these traditional Eastern regions having a complete inability to resist the will and the involvement of Europeans. Okay. With that, just like it caused unrest in Japan, it's also going to cause unrest in China itself. And so you see several kind of commoners, Chinese, resisting again the influence of the West. And so because the Chinese dynasty, if you were in class, I don't know how to say this, but let's try. Because of the inability of the Qing dynasty to prevent the power of the West, there are rebellions to overthrow that dynasty that had been in power for 200 years. And so the Taiping Rebellion is a initial revolution to get rid of the Manchus, to get rid of the Qing dynasty. After a decade of rebellion, though, with the help of the Europeans, the people in power crush the rebellion and the Qing dynasty stays in power. Another one is the Boxer Rebellion, which again, unhappy about the growing influence of the West, and specifically in this case, the growth of Christianity, which is seen as a Western religion, and its growth in China. And so the Boxers, to try to, with their vision of nationalism for China, which includes resisting the West and resisting Christianity, or the quote-unquote Western religion, the Boxer Rebellion again seeks to overthrow the ruling party, the Qing dynasty, and to create a new ruling dynasty in China created by the Chinese. For this particular rebellion initially, the Jing dynasty is happy to, to choose perhaps the lesser of two evils here, to try to rid themselves of the Europeans, to rid themselves of this foreign interference. However, in kind of one of the first idea, let me think about how I'm going to put this. In one of the first examples of a multinational alliance or many nations teaming up together to achieve something, 8 foreign powers make an agreement to end the Boxer Rebellion. And so if you're looking at my screen, I have a picture here, but essentially Britain, America, Spain, Germany, France, Italy, Japan, they agree to work together to all send military powers, to all together send military power to end the Boxer Rebellion in China. Now, it's not like it's done for the benefit of China. It's, of course, done for the benefit of those 8 foreign powers and the money they can make by continuing to establish dominance in China itself. But it is at least an example of a coalition of nations working together to achieve a goal on the international stage. As those foreign powers, the most powerful nations of the world, have success against the Boxer Rebellion, the Jing dynasty reverses and supports the foreign powers to end the Boxer Rebellion. Aftermaths. So even though the Boxer Rebellion is unsuccessful, there continues to be unrest in China. And I mention here that by 1911, again, the Jing dynasty is ended. And what you see, sort of like Japan, is a republican revolution. Okay, China, for a brief period of time, has a republican government, which is, again, an offshoot of the ideas of the Enlightenment and modernity and industrialization and all those processes that we saw in Western Europe and the American Revolution and the French Revolution, and the decrease in feudal power and the destruction of feudalism and monarchy in place of republics and democracy and constitutions. For a brief period of time before World War I, China also has a republic. Now, this will not last very long as we get later into the century and we see China go from a brief republic, of course, to what they have today, which is the Communist Party in China. Okay, so I think what I'm going to do here is I'm going to stop with that one, stop with that particular lesson. I'll probably actually upload 2 separate ones, and then you can kind of pick and choose what you want to listen to or don't want to listen to, and I'll put those all up on Google Classroom for our review. So, peace.